An elderly man sat quietly on his favorite park bench, but within minutes, a young officer's decision would turn this peaceful morning into a scene that shook an entire police department. He thought he was just doing his job. He had no idea the man he was harassing, and the stranger watching from behind him, were about to change his life forever. The first light of morning spilled over Oakwood Park, gilding the tops of the old oak trees in shades of amber and gold. Dew clung to the grass like a scatter of diamonds, shimmering as the sun climbed higher. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the mingled scents of damp earth and blooming dogwoods. Birds filled the branches with their chatter, and the gentle rustling of leaves offered a lullaby to the waking city. Slowly, the park stirred with life. An early jogger's sneakers tapped rhythmically against the paved path. A man tugged at his dog's leash as the animal strained toward a squirrel, and a mother pushed a stroller with soft determination. On a weathered wooden bench near the heart of the park sat Charles Thompson, his familiar silhouette steady against the backdrop of shifting light. At 78, time had carved deep lines into his face, but it had not diminished the quiet strength in his posture. His neatly pressed shirt was tucked into trousers that had seen better days, and over one arm rested a light jacket to ward off the morning chill. In his hands he held a steaming cup of coffee, the thin tendrils of warmth rising to meet the cool air. Beside him, folded with habitual care, lay his newspaper, waiting to be spread across his lap. And leaning against the bench was his cane, its handle worn smooth from years of loyal service. Charles savored the coffee with slow, deliberate sips, his eyes crinkling at the corners as the warmth traveled through him. Every morning, without fail, he came to this bench. It wasn't just a ritual. It was communion with the space he had once fought to create, a park born from a vision of unity and belonging. Watching the trees sway gently in the breeze, he felt the same quiet pride he had felt decades ago when the park was first unveiled to the public. It was his sanctuary, a piece of living history, a promise that progress, however fragile, could take root and grow. Far away, faint but distinct, the crackle of a police radio carried on the wind. A clipped voice barked codes and updates, answered by a younger one tinged with sharpness and urgency. Somewhere beyond the trimmed hedges, a uniform moved with purpose. The sound was easy to dismiss amid the harmony of the morning, but it threaded through the calm like an intrusive note, hinting at a presence that did not belong. Charles set his cup down on the bench and unfolded his newspaper. He adjusted his glasses, letting his eyes trace the neat columns of print, but his attention wavered when laughter rang out across the lawn. A pair of children dashed toward the fountain that bore his name, their sneakers slapping against the stone path. They chased each other with gleeful abandon, their voices high and musical, echoing against the stillness. Charles smiled, his chest swelling with affection and memory. He had dreamed of this. Children, black and white, playing side by side without the shadow of division that had once haunted every gathering place. To him, it was proof that the long nights, the marches, the speeches, the sacrifices, none of it had been in vain. A few benches down, half hidden by the drooping branches of a dogwood tree, sat another figure. At first glance, he could have been anyone. Another early riser, perhaps a man taking a moment before work. His casual clothes blended easily into the scene, his posture relaxed, his gaze seemingly unfocused. But if one looked closer, I might notice the stillness in his body, the intent way his eyes followed every detail of the park. He was no idle observer. He was a witness, waiting. The morning unfolded with deceptive peace. Pages of the newspaper rustled softly as Charles turned them, pausing now and then to sip his coffee or glance at the flowers blooming nearby. The joggers passed, nodding politely. The dog barked at another squirrel. The children shrieked with laughter as they splashed at the fountain's edge. And yet, beneath the serene tableau, a tension gathered quietly, as if the park itself was holding its breath. Charles leaned back, letting the sun warm his face, a smile lingering as he watched the children play. He had no inkling that this ordinary morning was about to fracture, that within moments, his patience, his dignity, and his place in the community he had spent a lifetime nurturing would be tested. Behind him, the unseen observer adjusted his seat ever so slightly, eyes narrowing with focus. Somewhere nearby, the radio crackled again, closer this time. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was charged with its approach. The calm of the park shattered with the crunch of boots on gravel. Officer Daniels entered the path with the stiff, almost mechanical gait of someone determined to project authority. The morning light glinted off his polished badge, catching the eye of a few joggers who slowed, then quietly moved on. Daniels was young, early 20s at most, his uniform crisp, his jaw set like stone. His radio hissed softly with static as he scanned the park, his gaze predatory, searching. Charles heard him before he saw him, the steady stomp of footsteps approaching like a drumbeat. He folded the corner of his newspaper and glanced up, his peaceful ritual interrupted. Daniel's eyes locked onto him almost immediately. The young officer's expression shifted, curiosity sharpening into suspicion, as though the simple act of sitting on a park bench required justification. "Excuse me, sir," Daniels called out, his voice louder than necessary, carrying through the quiet morning. Charles turned his head, eyebrows slightly raised, waiting. "What are you doing here?" The words were clipped, not a question so much as an accusation. Charles blinked, lowering his paper completely now, his coffee steaming beside him. "I'm enjoying my morning coffee," he said calmly, his voice smooth and measured. "Reading the paper, like I do every day." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He took a step closer, his hand unconsciously brushing the holster at his hip. "This is a residential area," Daniel said. "Do you live around here?" "Yes," Charles replied, still polite but with a growing edge to his tone. "Just a few blocks away on Maple Street. I've lived here for more than 30 years. Daniels frowned. "Funny," he said, tilting his head. "I haven't seen you around before." Charles met the officer's stare evenly. "That may be because you're new," he said quietly. "This park has been here longer than you've been alive, and I have been coming to this bench longer than you've been wearing that badge." A flicker of irritation passed over Daniel's face. His authority bristled under Charles's calm defiance. "Can you prove that?" Daniels asked suddenly, his tone sharp. Charles' grip tightened on his cane, his knuckles pale against the wood. Something in his chest constricted, not just from age or illness, but from memory. He had heard those words before, decades ago, when he was asked to prove he had the right to sit at a lunch counter, to drink from a water fountain, to walk down a certain street. "Officer," Charles said, his voice dropping into something deeper, steadier. "This is a public park. I am a resident. I have nothing to prove to you." Daniel's posture stiffened. He stepped closer until he was looming over the seated man. "You can either show me proof you live here, or you can move along," Daniel said. "Your choice." Charles exhaled slowly, folding his paper with deliberate care. He placed it on the bench and rose to his feet, his cane supporting him as he straightened to his full height. Though age had curved his back slightly, there was dignity in the way he stood, dignity that made Daniels hesitate for the briefest moment. "I will not be bullied out of a public space," Charles said. His voice carried weight, the kind of quiet authority earned over a lifetime of struggle. For a split second, the park was utterly still. A pair of joggers slowed to watch. A child's laughter, moments ago ringing across the fountain, went quiet. Somewhere under the dogwood tree, the silent observer leaned forward, his entire body tense. Daniel's jaw worked. Something in him, youth, pride, fear, snapped. "That's it," he said harshly, stepping forward and grabbing Charles's arm. The movement was sudden, violent. Charles staggered, his coffee cup falling and shattering on the gravel, the steaming liquid soaking into the earth. His cane clattered to the ground, rolling a few feet away. The air seemed to thicken, the world narrowing to the sight of the young officer's hand gripping the old man's sleeve. "Sir," Charles gasped, clutching at his chest, his breath suddenly shallow. "Please." But Daniels was already pulling him forward. The tension in the moment wound so tight it felt as though something might snap. From the bench under the dogwood, the mystery figure rose in one smooth, deliberate motion. The sunlight caught his face now, revealing the stern, commanding features of a man used to being obeyed. His voice cut through the air, sharp as a crack of thunder. "Stop!" Everything froze. Daniel's hand still gripping Charles's arm, Charles's cane lying forgotten on the path. The joggers, the onlookers, even the birds. The park was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The world seemed to narrow to a single point. The young officer's hand on Charles's arm. The old man's cane lying on the ground like a discarded lifeline. The morning light suddenly too bright, too harsh. Daniel's grip tightened, his knuckles white as though holding on to control itself. "Hands behind your back," Daniels barked, his voice ringing too loud in the fragile quiet of the park. Charles tried to steady his breath, but each inhale felt like fire in his chest. His heart pounded wildly, far too fast for a man his age, and a thin sheen of sweat broke out along his brow. Still, he refused to bow his head. "Officer," he said between gasps, "you are making a mistake. You're resisting," Daniel snapped, his voice rising. His free hand reached for the handcuffs at his belt, the metallic rattle sharp as glass shattering. I am not resisting, Charles said, louder now, his voice carrying the weight of years, of marches and protests and nights spent in jail cells for daring to demand equality. I am standing. A few feet away, a woman pushing a stroller stopped dead in her tracks, one hand going to her mouth. A jogger slowed, phone half raised, hesitating before hitting record. The park had gone quiet save for the uneven sound of Charles's breathing and the officer's increasingly harsh commands. On the bench, Daniels ordered, spinning Charles toward the wooden seat. The force of the motion made Charles stumble, his shoulder slamming into the bench with a sickening thud. He winced, his fingers gripping the edge of the wood to keep from falling. Please, he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. I have a heart condition. But Daniels wasn't listening. His pride, his training, his need to assert control, all of it collided in this moment, blinding him to the humanity of the man in front of him. He pressed Charles harder against the bench, fumbling with the cuffs. And then, the sound. It was just a single word, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Stop! Daniels froze, his hands still poised with the cuffs. Charles sagged against the bench, gasping for air, sweat trickling down the side of his face. Slow, measured footsteps approached, the sound of authority, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate. Each step rang out like a drumbeat announcing judgment. Daniels turned, and for the first time that morning, fear flickered across his face. The man who had been sitting silently under the dogwood now stood tall and imposing, his presence filling the space between the sea. His salt and pepper hair caught the morning light, his eyes sharp, his jaw set like granite. He wore no uniform, just plain clothes, but the badge clipped to his belt gleamed unmistakably. Release him, the man said, his voice steady but carrying a force that left no room for argument. Daniels hesitated, his fingers twitching against the cold metal of the cuffs. I said release him, Officer Daniels. The use of his name hit Daniels like a slap. He let go of Charles's arm at once, stepping back as though burned. Charles slumped onto the bench, clutching his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The man moved forward and crouched down, his expression softening as he met Charles's eyes. Mr. Thompson, he said quietly, respectfully, are you all right? Charles blinked, his vision clearing enough to focus. Recognition dawned, a flicker of relief breaking through the pain. Raymond, he said softly, voice shaking. The man, Chief Raymond Mitchell, straightened, turning to face Daniels. The warmth vanished from his expression, replaced by something hard and cold. Explain yourself, Mitchell said, each word precise, sharp as a knife. Daniels swallowed hard, his bravado draining out of him like water through a sieve. Around them, the park had come alive with whispers, phones held high, witnesses frozen in place, watching history unfold. Chief Mitchell's voice cut through the murmurs like a verdict. You have 10 seconds to give me a reason why you thought it appropriate to manhandle a respected elder of this community in a public park, or you can turn in your badge right now. Daniel's mouth opened, closed. No excuse came. Only the faint sound of the fountain gurgling in the background, like a clock ticking down. And for the first time that morning, Daniels realized he was no longer in control, and that this moment might define the rest of his life. Silence stretched through the park, taut as a bowstring. Daniels stood frozen, his hands still half raised, his chest heaving as though he'd just run a sprint. Chief Raymond Mitchell closed the remaining distance between them, his towering presence making Daniels seem suddenly, painfully young. Badge number, Mitchell said flatly. Daniels stiffened, swallowing hard. Sir, now. The single word cracked like thunder. Daniels fumbled to recite the number, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell's sharp nod cut him off before he could continue. You will report back to the station immediately after this conversation, the chief said, his tone even but bristling with restrained fury. Your weapon and badge will be placed on my desk until I decide if you're fit to wear them again. Daniel's mouth opened, but no sound came. He glanced around the park as if hoping for some invisible ally to save him, but there was no help coming. A small crowd had gathered. Joggers, parents, cyclists, morning regulars, their faces etched with shock, anger, and something else, expectation. Charles sat on the bench, his chest rising and falling as he fought to slow his breathing. Sweat trickled down his temple and his cane still lay on the ground. Mitchell bent to retrieve it, handing it back with quiet respect before turning once more to Daniels. You know who this man is? Mitchell's voice was calm now, but that calmness was dangerous, the kind that came before a storm ripped loose. Daniels shook his head mutely. This is Charles Thompson, Mitchell said, his voice ringing out so that everyone in the park could hear. He has lived in this neighborhood since before half the houses around here were even built. He helped design this park you were out to drag him out of. The fountain over there bears his name, and you thought he needed to prove he belonged here? The words landed like blows, each one driving Daniels further into silence. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, some nodding, some whispering, some recording. Mitchell stepped closer until there were only inches between them. "This community owes this man a debt we can never repay," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "And you dared lay hands on him." Daniel's face flushed crimson. His grip on his belt slackened, his earlier aggression now replaced by something rawer. Shame. He started, but Mitchell's hand shot up, silencing him. "You will have your chance to speak," the chief said, "but not here, not now. Right now, you will do two things. Apologize to Mr. Thompson, and then you will leave this park and think very carefully about the kind of officer you intend to be." The park was so still that even the birds seemed to pause. Daniels turned stiffly toward Charles, who sat watching with eyes that were calm but unyielding. I'm sorry," Daniels said, the words tumbling out awkwardly, barely audible. Charles held his gaze for a long moment, then he nodded once. Not absolution, not yet, but acknowledgement that the apology had been heard. Mitchell gave a short, sharp nod. "Go," he said, his voice like the slam of a gavel. Daniels turned and walked quickly away, his boots crunching against the gravel. No one spoke until he was gone, swallowed by the curve of the path. Only then did Mitchell's shoulders ease fractionally. He turned to Charles, crouching so they were eye level. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost fatherly. Charles shook his head slowly, though the hand gripping his cane trembled. "Not hurt," he said. "Just tired and angry." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "As you should be. This won't be swept aside, Charles. Not while I wear this badge." Charles gave a small, tired smile. "You sound just like your father," he murmured. Something flickered across Mitchell's face. Grief, pride, memory. "He always said justice wasn't just about enforcing the law," he said quietly. "It was about making things right." Mitchell straightened, turning to face the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying, "you've just witnessed something that should never have happened. I promise you there will be accountability, there will be training, and there will be change." A ripple of approval moved through the onlookers. Some applauded softly, others simply nodded, but the tension that had gripped the park seemed to release all at once, like a storm breaking and giving way to sun. Charles leaned back against the bench, letting the morning air fill his lungs. For the first time since Daniels had appeared, he felt steady. The cane in his hand felt like more than support. It felt like a staff of office, a symbol of the dignity he refused to surrender. Mitchell turned back to him. "Let me take you home," he offered. Charles shook his head, his gaze drifting toward the children by the fountain, who had resumed their play now that the danger had passed. "No," he said softly. "I think I'll stay a while. This is still my park." Mitchell smiled faintly, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Then I'll stay with you." And so the two men sat side by side, the chief and the elder, as the park slowly returned to life. But the moment was far from over. It was the beginning of something larger, something that would ripple outward, challenging an entire system to change. By the following morning, Oakwood Park was no longer just a quiet patch of green in the middle of the neighborhood. It had become the center of a storm. The video, shaky but clear, had been uploaded before Daniels even left the park. In the clip, Charles's cane lay on the ground while the young officer gripped his arm, and Chief Mitchell's voice cut through like a blade. "Release him now." The footage spread like wildfire, leaping from one social media platform to another, gaining thousands of views by nightfall and tens of thousands by sunrise. By mid-morning, the local news vans had appeared at the park entrance, reporters setting up cameras in the very spot where the confrontation had taken place. Residents stood nearby, giving interviews, pointing toward Charles's bench as though it had become a historic monument overnight. Words like profiling, excessive force, and accountability scrolled across TV screens in living rooms across the city. Charles had not left his house since the incident, but he sat at his kitchen table, his cane within reach, watching it all unfold. Part of him wanted to retreat, to shut off the television and let the whole thing blow over. He was tired, older now, not the man who used to stand on courthouse steps and thunder about civil rights. But then his phone buzzed. First with messages from neighbors offering support, then with calls from community leaders asking him to speak, and finally with a quiet voicemail from Chief Mitchell himself. "Charles," the chief's voice said, low and steady, "we have a problem. People are angry. Some are calling for Daniels to be fired, some want marches, some want my resignation. I'm holding a community forum tomorrow night at City Hall. I need you there. They need to hear from you. Please." Charles stared at the phone long after the message ended. His fingers traced the handle of his cane. This was bigger than him now, bigger than Daniels. This was about every person who had ever felt unwelcome in the park he had built. Every child who grew up feeling watched. Every parent who feared what might happen when their son was stopped on the street. That evening he made his way to the park. The sun was dipping below the horizon, staining the sky crimson. A small crowd had gathered near the fountain, candles flickering in paper cups, the air filled with the low hum of voices. People held handwritten signs: "Justice for Charles, end profiling, our park, our rights." When Charles approached, the crowd parted, falling into a respectful hush. He felt every eye on him, and for a moment the weight of expectation pressed on his chest, heavier than the confrontation ever had. He rested both hands on his cane and let the silence settle. "I built this park with a dream in mind," he said finally, his voice carrying easily in the quiet. "A dream of a place where every child, every family, every neighbor could come and feel safe. What happened here the other morning was not just about me. It was about that dream being threatened." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. A young man stepped forward, Marcus, Shanice's younger brother. His jaw was set, his voice hard. "They did the same thing to me last month," he said, "right there by the basketball court. Asked me where I lived, told me to leave. I didn't do anything wrong." Others spoke up, one after another. Stories of being stopped, questioned, sometimes even searched without cause. Charles listened, his heart heavy, but also burning with a familiar fire. "This ends now," he said when the voices quieted. "Tomorrow night, I will stand at City Hall and tell them exactly what happened here, and I won't stand alone. We will tell them every story we've heard tonight, and every story we've carried quietly until now." The crowd erupted in applause. The candles bobbed like stars, the flickering light reflecting in Charles's determined eyes. The next day, City Hall was packed to overflowing. Reporters crowded near the front, cameras trained on the podium. Police officers stood along the walls, some defensive, others uneasy. Chief Mitchell sat at the center of the panel, his expression grim but resolute. When Charles entered, leaning on his cane, the room fell silent. He walked slowly to the microphone, his every step echoing in the chamber. "I am not here to point fingers," he began, his voice calm but resonant. "I am here to hold up a mirror. What happened to me was wrong, yes, but it was not unique, and if we do nothing, it will happen again." He spoke of his youth, of the marches and the sit-ins, of the day Oakwood Park opened, and how he believed then that they had turned a corner. He spoke of the pride he had felt, the hope that this park would be a symbol of what was possible, and of the pain he felt when that hope was tested. As he spoke, Chief Mitchell watched from the panel table, his jaw tight. He could see the effect Charles's words were having, not just on the crowd, but on his own officers. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded, shame in their eyes, and then Mitchell made his choice. When Charles finished, the chief rose. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice ringing out like a verdict. "Officer Daniels is suspended without pay pending a full investigation, but this is bigger than one man. Starting today, every officer in this department will undergo community engagement and bias training, and I invite Mr. Thompson and anyone in this room willing to work toward real solutions to join me in creating that training." The crowd erupted, some cheering, some shouting questions, cameras flashing like lightning. Charles stood motionless for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then let's get to work," he said. The weeks that followed felt like standing at the eye of a hurricane, calm on the surface but charged with energy, change swirling on every side. The forum at City Hall had set something into motion that no one could stop. Every local paper ran the story, some with headlines that celebrated Chief Mitchell's promise of reform, others with headlines that questioned whether it would be enough. Charles became something of a reluctant public figure. People stopped him at the grocery store, in church, on the sidewalk, just to thank him, to tell him their own stories of fear, anger, or hope. Some were quiet, some were emotional, but all of them carried the same plea in their eyes: don't let this moment fade. He didn't. With Mitchell's backing, Charles helped assemble a diverse team of residents, young activists, faith leaders, educators, business owners, to work alongside the police department. For the first time in memory, officers sat in the same rooms as the people they rolled, not as adversaries, but as neighbors. They listened as Marcus described being stopped on his way home from basketball practice, as Maria presented sobering statistics on racial disparities in arrests, as Shanice spoke of raising her young son and wondering what kind of city he would grow up in. At first, some officers crossed their arms, their faces closed off, defensive. But as the weeks went by, as the conversations deepened, the room began to change. Voices that had been sharp with blame turned soft with understanding. Officers who once rolled their eyes now asked questions, stayed late, even volunteered for community outreach programs. And then came the surprise no one expected. One evening, just as the meeting was breaking up, the door opened and a familiar figure stepped in. Not in uniform this time, but in plain clothes. Daniels. His face was pale, his posture rigid, but his eyes carried something different. No longer defiance, but vulnerability. "I asked to be here tonight," he said quietly, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "I need to say something." All eyes turned to him. Charles, seated at the head of the table, simply nodded. Daniels took a breath so deep it seemed to shake him. "What I did that day was wrong," he said. "I let my pride, my assumptions, and my fear guide me, and I hurt a man who deserved my respect. I can't take it back, but I can change what I do going forward." He paused, glancing at Chief Mitchell, who gave him a single nod of encouragement. "I've requested to step down from patrol duty," Daniels continued. "I want to work full-time in the Community Engagement Division, and I want to start by volunteering here, with all of you. Not because it's part of my punishment, because I need to rebuild what I broke." The room was silent for a long beat, and then Charles slowly rose to his feet, leaning on his cane. He crossed the short distance between them until he was standing face to face with the young man who had once humiliated him in front of the entire park. "You've taken the first step," Charles said softly. "And sometimes, son, that's the hardest one." He extended his hand. Daniels hesitated, then took it, his grip firm, his eyes bright with unshed tears. The weeks stretched into months, and the ripple of change spread far beyond Oakwood Park. Other neighborhoods began hosting their own forums. Other cities called Chief Mitchell, asking for guidance on launching similar programs. News outlets began running stories not just of the confrontation, but of the healing that followed, showing police officers and teenagers working side by side to plant new trees in the park, holding basketball tournaments, setting up after-school tutoring sessions. On the first anniversary of the confrontation, the city held a rededication ceremony at the park. The fountain that already bore Charles Thompson's name now had a new plaque installed. Oakwood Park, a place for all people, dedicated to those who stand for justice, build bridges, and choose understanding over fear. The mayor spoke first, then Chief Mitchell, but it was Charles's turn that brought the crowd to their feet. "I once thought change would come all at once," Charles said, his voice steady but rich with emotion. "Like a wave sweeping away everything in its path. But I've learned that real change comes like the seasons. Slow, steady, sometimes hard to notice until one day you look around and everything is blooming." He turned toward Daniels, who stood among a group of young volunteers, no longer the brash officer but a man remade by the work he had chosen to do. "Even the hardest ground can grow something beautiful, if you are willing to plant the seed," Charles said. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that echoed against the trees, carried on the breeze, and seemed to settle into the very soil of the park. Children splashed in the fountain, their laughter ringing like music. For the first time in a long time, Charles felt light. Not because the work was over, but because it was continuing, carried by many hands. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold, Charles sat once more on his familiar bench. Mitchell joined him, and together they watched as Daniels crouched to tie a child's shoelace, as Marcus explained a basketball drill to a group of kids, as Shanice laughed with other young mothers. "This," Charles said quietly, almost to himself, "is what we dreamed of when we built this park." "And this is just the beginning," Mitchell replied. Charles nodded, the faintest smile tugging at his lips as the breeze rustled the leaves above them. The storm had passed, but it had left something behind. Not wreckage, but renewal. And for the first time in a long time, Oakwood Park felt not just like a sanctuary, but like a promise fulfilled.